This video is called Brick by Brick. It's video 5.2.3, and this is where we're going to go into detail of each of the bricks. As I mentioned, the Global South is considered to be 133 countries all clumped together in one term. And as I also mentioned, that one of the key differences of the Global South is that there are some success stories, economic success stories of such astronomical growth that these countries are by some standards outperforming many of the countries in the Global North. And the success stories are known collectively in the acronym with the BRICS. You have Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I'm going to go over each of the stories of how these states got where they are today, and you'll see that each of them tried a different path. So in fact, even among the countries that are the success stories, you see different paths towards success from each of them. Let's start with Brazil. Brazil is something that can be categorized as a country that we call a newly industrialized country, or a NIC. You see this in your textbook as well. But a newly industrialized country is a country that had relied predominantly on other things other than industry and then decides to industrialize. Specifically, Brazil was a strong agricultural country, and this was a somewhat blurry picture of soybeans on the left side. And if you see the left side, you have soybeans, on the right side you have tofu. And this is actually a true story of Brazil's development. Brazil originally was growing most of the world's soybean supply in order to export to Asian countries, including Japan, who would then use their industry to process it into tofu. Well, as Brazil was looking around and realizing that if you sell bushels of soybeans, you get very little profit on it. However, if you build factories and process those soybeans into tofu, you can make a much larger product because there's much more value added. And as a result, Brazil started to create a large industrial sector and began moving their agricultural products. For example, they grew wheat and corn and started processing them into cereal and then exporting that cereal rather than just the wheat and corn. So this is a way in which you can build industry so as to then increase the profits on your exports. The next story is Russia. Now, we mentioned this a little bit, but after the Cold War, Russia was the largest country to come out of the Soviet Union and considered the strongest and kind of the center of where the Soviet Union once was. Well, Russia built its economy after the Cold War on oil. It was at a time where the Middle East was the main producer of oil, the countries in the Middle East, and the United States, for various reasons, were looking for other places to invest in oil, to gather their oil, as well as the European Union. And as a result, Russia served as a wonderful alternative to the Middle East oil supply. And Russia has vast amounts of oil resources and really grew its economy based on this one commodity. So this is a country that's known as a resource-rich country and determined that it would develop on resources. India. India did a very smart thing and said, if we start industrializing now, we may not be able to compete with those who've been industrializing since the 1800s, the US, Great Britain, Germany, France. And so what India did instead was it looked around at the global north, at those countries, and said, well, what are they doing well? And the answer was, they're already doing service. They are in, as you know, many of you will graduate and you're not going to do a factory, you're not going to be on a factory floor. Instead, what you probably will do, if you haven't already, is do some sort of service. Either maybe initially you'll serve in a restaurant. Eventually you can move into service sectors like you worked for Verizon or some other telecommunication company, or you could go to work in a middle management. For example, my husband sells wine, is in a wine distributor. All of this is part of a service economy in which you serve it's less about a good being produced and more about a service being provided. And India did a really good job of looking around and realizing it had a lot to offer the world in terms of a service economy. It has a well-educated, huge labor force that is low cost. It pays lower wages than in the United States, as well as other countries. And so India started taking over these service sectors that didn't need to be geographically located. Now, just recently I called and I asked a question of Delta about a flight I was going on, and I spoke to a wonderful gentleman from Mumbai. This particular job does not have to be done in Atlanta, Georgia, even though Delta is headquartered there, and so they outsourced to India, and India provides a lot of this service sector that it did, but that we once did. China. As I mentioned, during the Cold War, Richard Nixon decided to visit China and begin a trade relationship with China. Well, in the 1970s, China figured out that it also had a large labor force, a very low-cost labor force. And so what China began doing is deciding that even though it was a communist country, it would need to start making reforms if it was going to grow as a communist giant, as a superpower. And so what China began doing is moving towards more capitalistic tendencies. So it still calls itself a communist government, and yet it engages in capitalism, not democracy, but capitalism. China has built many, many factories, and initially what China exported to the world was a bunch of cheap goods. I mean, we'll talk about the things that are sold at the dollar store. And when I was growing up, when you said made in China, it meant not of great quality, but very affordable. Walmart took off during the during the 80s and 90s because it was able to source so much of this stuff from China rather than domestically. So it was able to have a lot of Chinese goods and sell it for much cheaper. And as you can see from this graph, it's not important to really examine this graph in a lot of detail, but as you can see, it started even by 1993, it was doing primary goods was a large part. That little red part was a significant part of what it was exporting, or parts and components or semi-finished goods. And then you start to see that it starts to work its way into doing more of the semi-finished goods for a while, and then the capital goods, the goods that require some sort of value added. Nowadays, what China will predominantly do is be in charge of not the research and development, not coming up with the next greatest good, but instead taking that good and assembling it. When I talked about where you would put your iPhone factory, it would more likely be that China, that's where Apple has decided to put much of its factories, has enough of an educated workforce that they can assemble these goods at a much cheaper level than we can still do. And China has figured out what the world wants to buy and continues to export it. So China's success story is really what's called an export-led market economy, figuring out what the world wants to buy, producing it as cheaply as possible, and exporting it to the world. South Africa. Now, South Africa sometimes gets left off of the BRICS because it was the first it never performed as well as the others, and it was the first to stop performing as well. In many cases, I say that this is because it chose kind of a hybrid of all of those other options and never really stuck to one of those plans that really had it do well. That's a more stable economy, so maybe the growth wasn't as significant. And as we'll go into detail, Russia, China, and to a lesser extent India have all kind of, and Brazil, have suffered from a little bit of stagnated growth. So perhaps choosing just one of these ways of growing strong isn't the most stable way you can grow an economy. But South Africa chose a little bit of all of these different strategies. It's resource rich. It has iron, ore, gold, diamonds. South African diamonds are well known. It chose to be a newly industrialized country. It built a little bit of an industry by taking gold, diamonds, platinum, and other metals and minerals and starting to, especially for the heavier metals, starting to melt them down and put them into steel rods or things like that so they can be used automatically. They don't have to be shipped in their raw form. Export, it relied on attracting semi-finished goods, similar to how I told you that China does, where there is a little bit of a technological factories where they kind of assemble and create kind of semi-finished goods that are then sent other places to be fully finished. And a service economy. Almost 66%, two-thirds of the South African GDP is in tourism and telecommunications industry. So it's called what I would say is a hybrid economy of growth.